You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
When I moved to Australia in 2003, I struggled for 7 months to settle in one place. So for 7 months, I moved 4 rooms and houses until I found a flat where I stayed for the following 14 years, and that was in Richmond. One of the first things that I did as soon as I found what I can call home was to see how I can decorate it with some art. And given my extremely limited budget, I downloaded 150 images from the work of the late Palestinian artist and cartoonist Naji Al-Ali, who lived from 1938 until 1987. I printed out something like maybe 50 of the images. I took them home. I had discovered the Australian invention, blue tack, as a replacement of adhesive, and I created my own gallery in the only space that I had, which is basically the living room. So yes, it was for artistic reason or an attempt to make artistic decoration, but also it became conversation opener where as soon as any of my friends back then from international students would walk in, they would be asking about the cartoons, the artist, the story behind it, and ask about Handala, the signature of the cartoonist on every of these cartoons. So Naji Al-Ali did not sign his cartoons with his initials. Instead, he created a fictional character that he called Handala. A 10-year-old boy, spiky hair, tattered clothes, barefoot, who refuses to face the world, to face the viewer, is giving us his back. I ask myself this question after 22 years. Why was it so easy for me to straight away think of Naji Al-Ali's cartoons to put on my walls as opposed to maybe any other art? And the answer is yes, it's the content of the cartoons and the stories, but equally importantly, it's Handala, the character, the symbol. So let me tell you about Handala. This fictional cartoon was created in 1969 by the Palestinian cartoonist Naji Al-Ali. At first, Handala would face the viewer and be sometimes part of the story in the cartoon, sometimes throwing rocks at occupation soldiers, sometimes waking up a sleepy man, sometimes with a bubble thought with text in it, talking to someone in the cartoon, and sometimes jumping or smiling or laughing or crying or being angry at someone. But in 1973, after what the Israelis call Yom Kippur War, what the Egyptians call October War, and what the Syrians call Tishreen War, and Tishreen is October in the Babylon calendar that is used in Syria, and what some other Arabs call Ramadan War because it happened during the month of Ramadan. So after that war, there was a tendency among Arab countries to accept a political settlement and impose it on the Palestinians. So to represent or embody the rejection of the political concessions, Handala turned his back to the viewers and to the world in protest of attempts to impose political compromise on the Palestinians. And he never turned his face to the viewer ever since. So from 1973 onward, he's giving us his back, and he will always be 10 years old. So Naji, the creator of this fictional icon, Handala, when he was asked about the name, he said, I named this character after Handal, which is bitter herb that grows in the middle of the desert despite the harshest of all conditions, despite the scarcity of water, and nevertheless refuses to die and grows in the middle of the most destitute and poor circumstances. And when he was asked why always 10 years old, and he said, I was 10 years old when I left Palestine, when I was driven out of Palestine into southern Lebanon. And I will never forget the image of this poor boy on foot leaving Palestine for the last time. So Handala is the embodiment of the dispossession of the Palestinian refugees, those who were driven out, those who were ethnically cleansed from Palestine in 1948. So Handala will always be 10 years old. To Naji and all Palestinian refugees, it's like time has stopped ever since they had left Palestine. I will come back with more about Naji Ali and Handala. Stay with me.
Hi, this is Rafif Ziada, and you're listening to 3CR, pro-Palestinian, happily proud radio.
Naji Ali and his family were made refugees when he was 10 years old. We have to remember that 900,000 Palestinians were driven out to 7 locations in 1948. 2 of the 7 internally displaced in Palestine, that is West Bank and Gaza, and 5 into Arab countries, that is Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq. So Naji found himself in a refugee camp in what later became Ain el-Hilwa refugee camp, which is the biggest camp for the Palestinians in Lebanon. Ain el-Hilwa refugee camp. And there he grew up among tens of other thousands of Palestinians who grew up in the harshest of conditions. When he was 20, he had joined a pan-Arab nationalist party, but his membership was suspended 4 times in 1 year for lacking discipline reasons. In 1961, his first cartoons was published, but when another Palestinian icon noticed him, Ghassan Kanafani, who was editor-in-chief in one of the magazines, in September 1961, he published Naji's first cartoon, which was a portrait of a hand coming out of a tent. And in 1963, like many other Palestinian children of Nakba who grew up in the poverty of refugee camps, wanted to change their lives and the life of their families to the better, and they migrated to the Gulf countries who needed manpower to build their states after the exploration of oil in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in Emirates, in Bahrain, and in Oman. So he went to Kuwait and started working for several Kuwaiti outlets, and from there he started drawing political cartoons for a Siyasa newspaper in Kuwait, and maybe before that At-Tali'a newspaper. And in 1969, he created Handala. So Naji lived in Kuwait and made himself a family and started sending cartoons to not just Kuwaiti newspapers, but also newspapers in Lebanon by mail, particularly a Safir newspaper. The Safir was a progressive newspaper in Beirut, and I remember listening to a documentary about Mahmoud Darwish, the Palestinian poet, where he would say that when I buy a Safir every day, I would read it backwards. I would start with the last page because of Naji Ali's cartoons there. Because Naji was more capable of reflecting the pulse of the Palestinian refugees. He was not worried about how you could tone down the angry voices of the crowds or the masses. He would just put forward the messages as they are. And if you want to know what's happening inside a camp, you have to see what Naji Al-Ali has to say on the last pages of As-Safir newspaper in Lebanon and Al-Qabas newspaper in Kuwait. And let me tell you about Al-Qabas newspaper. Al-Qabas is the Arabic word for the torch, and it was seen as one of the most progressive minarets of journalism in the Arab world in the late 70s and early 80s. Kuwait, relatively speaking, was progressive in the 70s and 80s compared to the rest of the Gulf countries and even to the Levantine countries and Egypt and North Africa. So there was some sort of democracy. There was parliament and political parties, and there were a level of freedom of expression in their newspaper, and they opened the gate for pro-Palestinian cartoonists and writers and pan-Arab intellectuals to contribute to their newspapers. And Najil Ali was one of the names that made Al-Qabas newspaper regional and even international. But I cannot talk about Naji and Al-Qabas without talking about another intellectual from Iraq, who, together with Naji, formed an amazing pair that Arab journalism has never seen before or after. That other intellectual is still alive. His name is Ahmed Matar, the Iraqi poet, who escaped the restriction of freedom of expression in Iraq to Kuwait and started writing short freestyle poetry under the banner of Lafitat. And Lafitat is plural of Lafita, and Lafita means sign. So the signs, the Lafitat of Ahmed Matar, the cartoons of Najil Ali, every day on Al-Qabas newspaper in Kuwait, made this newspaper a real minaret of not only freedom of speech and freedom of expression, but also reminding the Arab viewers and readers of their moral compass, the Palestinian cause, despite all the distractions, in time of the civil war of Lebanon, in time of the Syrian involvement that became occupation of Lebanon, in time of the Israeli invasion of South Lebanon and the subsequent occupation of South Lebanon, in time of the Iraq-Iranian war, in time of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the subsequent growth of the Mujahideen movement, and in time of the growing tension between the newly born Iranian regime, Al-Khomeini, and the other Arab countries, and in time of the aftermath of the Camp David agreement after Egypt drifted away from the Arab-Israeli conflict and isolated itself. And in time of all that, the signs of Ahmed Matar and the cartoons of Najil Ali were very powerful reminders of our moral compass and of the Palestinian dispossession, the Palestinian statelessness, the Palestinian struggle, and the Palestinian injustice. In 1985, Najil Ali's time in Kuwait came to an end when there was so much pressure by several Arab countries on Kuwaiti government that you cannot continue opening your newspapers to opposition journalists and cartoonists and poets, because Naji and Ahmed were seen by other Arab countries as opposition figures. There was sheer pressure on the government of Kuwait, and the Kuwaiti government pressured Al-Qabas newspaper until the newspaper was forced to deport 25 journalists from Kuwait. Most of them returned to their countries, and those who cannot return to their countries ended up in the West. Particularly Ahmed and Naji went to London. And in London, Naji started sending his cartoons to Al-Qabas by fax. And he kept doing that every day, sending his cartoons to Al-Qabas every day until the 22nd of July 1987, when Najil Ali was assassinated as he was walking on one of the streets of London. Naji before his assassination, even predicted the first Intifada and even gave it its name, the word Intifada, in one of his cartoons. And it said literally, Intifadat al-Daffa al-Gharbiyya, the Intifada of West Bank. And that cartoon was 7 months before December 87, when the first Intifada broke out in Gaza and then in West Bank. Naji, in his will, asked to be buried in Ain al-Hilwa refugee camp in Lebanon, but that was not possible after his assassination. So he was buried in London. I spoke with Nasri Hajjaj, a Palestinian filmmaker who knew Naji Ali, who also was born and who also grew up in Ain al-Hilwa refugee camp. And in my interview with Nasri Hajjaj, he told me about the temporary burial, which means that he is buried in London temporarily until Palestine is liberated, until he can go and be buried in a Shajara village in Palestine. He also told me that Naji told him that the other characters in his cartoons, Fatima and her husband with big mustache, are based on true characters, true people in Ain al-Hilwa refugee camp. Naji is regarded as one of the top 10 most influential cartoonists in the world in the 20th century. Naji Ali gave us, in addition to the stories, in addition to the reminder of the moral compass, gave us Handala. And Handala is still alive. Handala is still 10 years old. Handala is with us on our signs, at protests on our walls as graffiti. As we speak today, the 19th of July, Handala was chosen to be the name of Freedom Flotilla that sailed from Zaragoza, Spain, to Gaza to break the blockade and to defy the starvation. And guess who is on board that flotilla? He is our member of Palestine Remembered and our good friend Robert Martin. So it is not a coincidence that the organizers of the Freedom Flotilla thought of Handala as a great name because Handala gave them the symbol. It symbolizes the Palestinian struggle. And here are some words by Robert Martin just a few minutes before Handala sails to Palestine from Zaragoza.
I'm in Siracusa, waiting for the Handala to arrive, and we have a community of people coming out to show support, and all the locals that help, feeding, housing, doing all sorts of things that we could not do without. All over the world, these guys do work, and they remain nameless normally.
3CR, your station, your voice.
With this, we've come to the end of this week's episode of Palestine. Remember, do not forget to tune in next week, same time, 9:30 in the morning. Until then, this is Yusuf Ahmed Al-Rimawi, wishing you the best of all times and salam.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast. If you found it valuable, please consider donating or subscribing to support independent community radio. To find out more, go to 3cr.org.au.